It was March of 1944. The night sky over western Germany was burning. What should have been a routine run on the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt had become a graveyard of falling silver dots, each one a flying fortress breaking apart in silence before fire consumed it mid-air. But one fortress didn't fall. At 20,000 feet, the Sky Witch staggered through the darkness, wings trembling, tail half-shredded, 2 engines gone, a third coughing itself to death, the airframe moaning with every gust. Inside, the smell of cordite and burning insulation mixed with the cold stink of fear. The pilot, Captain Drew Keller, was slumped forward, oxygen mask torn, blood dark on his collar. The co-pilot wasn't moving either. In the chaos behind them, the crew shouted for help, voices cracked, radio dead, control cables severed by shrapnel. That's when Lieutenant Robert Hanley, the navigator, did something that defied every manual, every rule, and maybe physics itself. By the time the sun rose, this aircraft would land safely without a conscious pilot, without autopilot, and without reason. What happened inside that crippled B-17 remains one of the strangest and least believed flight recoveries of the Second World War. Robert Hanley grew up in a small Ohio town where engines outnumbered people. His father fixed tractors, his mother fixed radios. By age 12, he was known locally as the kid who could make anything work again as long as it had wires. When the family Philco stopped playing swing music, he didn't call for help. He opened the back panel, burned his hand once, and made it sing again. He wasn't trained in engineering, he just understood how current flowed, how a circuit could be convinced to behave. When he joined the Army Air Forces in 1941, he thought he'd be allowed to tinker. Instead, he found that military machines came with manuals, and manuals came with rules. During navigation school, Hanley spent nights secretly rewiring training radios. He claimed it made reception less screechy. Instructors called it tampering with property of the United States government. His punishment was kitchen duty, but the other cadets started bringing their gear to him quietly. They called him Wires. Hanley was assigned to the 306th Bomb Group in late 1943, the same unit that had taken catastrophic losses over Germany. To him, the B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just a bomber. It was a living thing. Every vibration, every hum of the instrument panel told him something. The fortress spoke, and he listened. But his obsession with fixing things unnerved his commanding officers. Once, he was caught running a bypass wire through a radio amplifier so the crew could hear BBC London more clearly on long flights. The maintenance officer barked, "You'll get yourself court-martialed, Lieutenant." Hanley just smiled and said, "Maybe, but at least I'll get the weather report while it happens." He was brilliant and reckless, and on the morning of March 19th, 1944, when the Sky Witch rolled out onto the airfield at Thurley, no one knew that Hanley's rule-breaking would soon become the only reason any of them would live. The mission briefing that morning was supposed to be routine, or as routine as any daylight run over Germany could be. Target: Schweinfurt. Objective: cripple the ball-bearing plants feeding Hitler's war machine. Expected resistance: moderate to heavy flak. Everyone knew what moderate meant. It meant half of you won't make it back. Captain Drew Keller, Sky Witch's pilot, was a by-the-book officer. Crisp, quiet, obsessed with discipline. He didn't like Hanley's tinkering and had told him more than once, "If you want to play engineer, join Boeing." But even Keller couldn't deny that the navigator had a strange way of making things work smoother. At 0600 hours, the Fortress thundered down the runway, tail rising, engines glowing like 4 angry suns. Hanley sat behind his map table, pencil in hand, headphones crackling with coded chatter. Everything was normal until they crossed into enemy airspace. The first hit came from below, a sharp whump, then silence. Flak burst just ahead of the right wing, peppering the nacelle of Engine 3. Metal shrapnel cut through the fuselage like razors. The control column jerked. Keller fought it, swearing under his breath. Within seconds, the formation broke apart in smoke and chaos. German fighters dove through the bomber stream, their cannon shells leaving streaks of orange fire. The intercom erupted in panic. "Tails hit! We lost the interphone! Engine 4's running hot!" Then, a new sound, something dull and heavy. A direct flak burst ripped through the cockpit floor. Keller's voice cut off mid-command. Hanley looked up, both the pilot and co-pilot slumped forward. Blood on the instruments, hands still gripping the yokes. The Fortress began to roll right, slowly, then faster. Hanley's stomach lurched as the horizon tilted. He clawed forward through the smoke, grabbing the frame of the navigator's chair to steady himself. The Sky Witch was dying, hydraulic pressure bleeding away, aileron cables half severed, the trim wheel spinning uselessly. And yet somehow she didn't fall. The left wing dropped, then steadied. The nose rose, just enough to hold level. Hanley stared, breathless. What the hell? He reached for the trim, turned it slightly, and felt resistance, the kind that shouldn't exist. The trim servo, powered by auxiliary electrics, was still alive, barely. Every few seconds, it pulsed a faint tremor through the column. The Fortress was correcting herself, as if something deep inside still fought to stay aloft. Hanley didn't know it yet, but that quivering pulse would become his only ally, and soon it would be the heartbeat of a machine that refused to die. Smoke curled through the cockpit, mixing with the bitter stench of hydraulic fluid. The interphone was dead, gauges fogged with frost, and the Fortress trembled like a wounded animal. Hanley coughed, pulling his scarf over his mouth, blinking through the haze at the faintly glowing instrument panel. He didn't have long. The Fortress was descending not fast enough to spin out, but steady enough to die slowly. The altimeter read 10,000 feet, then flickered off completely. He checked the circuit box. Shrapnel had torn through half the fuses, but the auxiliary bus, the emergency power feed, still pulsed faintly. Enough current to light a cigarette, maybe, but not enough to save a bomber. He thought about the manuals. Never reroute circuits mid-flight, never touch the trim servo directly. Never. Hanley cut the thought short. Rules didn't matter anymore. He pulled open the navigator's panel, revealing a web of wires, some blackened, some still, sparking. He stripped a few strands from the headphone cord, then from the backup compass coil, the thin copper wiring so delicate it snapped if you breathed too hard. Then, with hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, he did what no pilot, mechanic, or engineer was ever trained to do. He cross-wired the Fortress's elevator trim circuit directly into the radio amplifier. To anyone else, it would have sounded insane connecting flight control to the radio. But Hanley knew what he was doing, at least in theory. The amplifier operated on a fluctuating signal vibration, tone, electrical echo. If he could loop that oscillation into the trim actuator, he could make it self-correct every time the nose dipped. He wasn't creating stability. He was creating a feedback ghost, an endless cycle of tiny corrections. A mechanical heartbeat. He tightened the last wire with his teeth, sparked it, and braced. For a second, nothing happened. Then the plane shuddered violently, as if struck by invisible turbulence. The trim wheel spun, stopped, spun again. The Fortress leveled. "Come on, girl," he muttered. "Talk to me." The radio crackled random static, but the static fed back into the trim, each pulse causing a micro-adjustment. It was primitive, dangerous, and utterly impossible. Yet the plane held altitude. The Sky Witch was flying herself not perfectly, but enough to glide. Down in the fuselage, the remaining crew stared forward, watching Hanley crawl back from the cockpit, his face pale but determined. "She's holding steady," he gasped. "Don't ask how." For the next 6 hours, the suicide patch, as Hanley would later call it, kept the Fortress alive, a Frankenstein fusion of radio waves, copper, and pure stubbornness. And at that moment, in the frozen night over Europe, a navigator had unknowingly created something that didn't exist yet, an analog version of fly-by-wire. The Fortress drifted through the night like a half-dead bird, engines coughing, wings trembling. 2 propellers spun lazily, a third barely turning, its pitch uneven. The cockpit windows had iced over from the inside, forcing Hanley to navigate blind. guided only by instinct and what little static came through the radio. Below them stretched occupied Europe, endless darkness, punctuated by the dull orange flashes of anti-aircraft fire far to the east. The rest of the formation had vanished hours ago. Skywitch was alone. Hanley glanced at his wristwatch. Just past midnight, the emergency oxygen tanks were running dry. He counted 3 other surviving crewmen, the waist gunner, the radio operator, and the bombardier, all huddled under blankets, shivering. The others didn't move anymore. He crawled back into the cockpit, brushing frost from the radio. Static hissed, then a faint German voice bled through the noise, the low, measured rhythm of Luftwaffe ground controllers. Hanley had studied their frequency patterns. The direction and tone, shifts told him what his dead compass couldn't, where he was. He used his patched trim circuit to listen to the radio's echo. Each time the aircraft veered off heading, the static's pitch changed ever so slightly. He tuned into that, hand on the trim, letting the Fortress correct herself through feedback. It wasn't flight, it was symbiosis. The idea was insane, yet it worked. Every time the plane began to drop, the new circuit kicked the tail just enough to lift it. Every time it banked too far, the oscillation stabilized the roll. It was as though the Skywitch had developed a will of her own. Hours passed in a haze of frost and exhaustion. Hanley's fingers bled from rewiring, his breath shallow. The cockpit lights flickered, casting long shadows over the unconscious pilot and co-pilot. Then another sound, a faint whistle. The bombardier shouted, "Messerschmitts!" Me 110 seconds appeared out of the clouds, slicing through moonlight, approaching from above and to the rear. Hanley's heart stopped. The Fortress was limping, slow, barely controllable. There was no way they could fight. But something strange happened. The broken feedback loop that held the trim also made the Fortress vibrate irregularly. Its movements became erratic, dipping, shuddering, yawing side to side as if in turbulence. To the German pilots, the motion looked deliberate. A crippled decoy, maybe booby-trapped, or already abandoned. They hesitated. One made a cautious pass, fired a short burst and missed completely as the Fortress jerked upward in a sudden, random oscillation. The tracers sliced through empty air. After 2 more half-hearted attacks, they pulled away, convinced the bomber was finished. Hanley watched them disappear into the clouds and let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "You crazy, beautiful machine," he whispered. "You just scared them off." By dawn, the English Channel appeared faint glimmers of silver water through mist. The Fortress, running on 2 engines and a miracle, began to descend. Hanley adjusted the feedback one last time, guiding her toward the first open field he saw. The landing gear refused to drop. He didn't care. He aimed for flat ground, cut power, and braced. The Skywitch hit the earth hard, skidding, tearing through grass and mud before the left wing snapped, and the wreckage came to rest in silence. And yet she didn't burn. When rescue crews reached the site an hour later, they found a navigator slumped against the control yoke, half-conscious, whispering to the plane as if afraid she'd stop breathing. She hadn't just made it home. She'd done something no one believed was possible. When Hanley woke up, he was in a hospital cot, white sheets, bandaged hands, and a nurse asking him if he could hear properly. For a few seconds, he thought he was dead. Then, he noticed the sound, faint static in the background, a radio playing somewhere nearby. His first words were, "Don't turn that off." The Skywitch had landed in a farmer's field just miles from the English coast. The locals swore they saw the plane coming in, steady as a glider, though no one had been at the controls. The official report listed the cause as partial trim malfunction, probable miracle. When the investigators from Wright Field arrived, they were less poetic. They tore into the wreckage with clipboards and flashlights, tracing the strange web of wires through the cockpit. It took them a full day to realize what Hanley had done, and another week to believe it. He'd bridged the aircraft's flight controls into the communications system, effectively allowing noise to become stability. One engineer, baffled, called it a suicide patch with perfect balance. Another simply muttered, "If this had gone wrong, the plane would have torn itself in half." Hanley was summoned before a review board, not a ceremony. Not yet, just a table of stern-faced officers with too many medals and too few imaginations. They accused him of improper modification of government property during active combat operations. He didn't argue. He simply said, "Sir, I didn't have a manual for what was happening." The room was silent. One colonel leaned forward. "Do you understand what you built, Lieutenant?" Hanley shrugged. "I built a chance." Behind the scenes, something remarkable happened. The engineers who studied Skywitch couldn't stop talking about it. What Hanley had accidentally created was a feedback damping system, a primitive form of what scientists at MIT were only beginning to theorize. Instead of punishing him, the Air Force quietly reclassified the incident. No disciplinary action, no medals either, just a memo stamped filed experimental stabilization phenomenon, do not replicate. A single note was found etched in pencil on the inside of the wrecked trim panel. "Talk to her gently," she listens. It was signed R. Hanley. That line would make its way through flight schools for decades, uncredited, half forgotten, whispered by engineers who admired it without ever knowing where it came from. The man who should have been court-martialed had instead written the first accidental draft of modern flight control logic. And yet, when reporters tried to reach him after the war, Hanley refused interviews. "The Fortress did it," he told one persistent journalist in 1947. "I just helped her remember how." After the war ended, Robert Hanley disappeared from the military record like smoke through broken glass. His discharge papers were ordinary service complete, honorable. No mention of his strange flight, no note of what the Skywitch had done. Just another navigator going home to Ohio. He settled quietly in Dayton, where he repaired radios and wind-up clocks. Neighbors said he rarely spoke about the war. The only hint of his past was an old photo of a B-17 pinned above his workbench. The name, Skywitch, faded but still legible. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit with a screwdriver in hand and trace invisible circuits on the table, muttering to himself, as if trying to explain something no one else could see. But the story didn't die with him. At Wright Field now, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base engineers cataloguing captured German technology found themselves discussing something familiar. The Germans had experimented with servo stability feedback, small circuits that corrected control surfaces automatically. The principle was identical to what Hanley had improvised. Word spread quietly through the American design bureaus. MIT engineers studying post-war control theory stumbled across a forgotten report titled Stabilization Through Oscillation Feedback B-17 Incident March 1944. The author was listed as anonymous, but the wiring diagrams matched Hanley's patch exactly. By 1948, researchers had a name for it: Dynamic Stability Assist. They called it a groundbreaking test of closed-loop correction under live combat conditions. They didn't mention it was invented by a half-frozen navigator with bleeding hands and a dead crew. In the 1950s, as jet aircraft became faster and more unstable, the theory was reborn as fly-by-wire damping. The same feedback logic kept F-86 Sabres steady in dives and stabilized early missile guidance systems. Every digital autopilot that came later, every Airbus, every F-16, carries a ghost of that original idea. One engineer, decades later, called it the day chaos became controllable. Hanley never patented anything, never claimed credit. When he passed away quietly in 1968, the obituary made no mention of the Skywitch, just that he had served honorably in the Army Air Forces and enjoyed tinkering with radios. But among a handful of flight historians and aeronautical engineers, his story became legend, an unverified miracle, a myth of man and machine. They said that night over Germany, a navigator didn't save a bomber. He taught it how to save itself. And deep in the Air Force archives, in a brittle maintenance log labeled Recovered Components, Skywitch, someone underlined one sentence in faded ink: she wasn't flying herself. I was just reminding her how.